Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's interview is from the archives. It's a Detransitioner legacy with Helena Kerschner. The original interview was conducted in March of 2019, which is 5 years ago, if you can believe that. I've developed a lot, she's developed a lot, and I think this conversation around transition, detransition, and teen mental health has developed quite a bit since then. I've been going through my detransition interviews, seeing if I can compile them into a book of some sort to capture these stories in a way that is more distilled, more accessible to a different or broader audience. Helena's kind of stepped back, so far as I know, from public discourse, but I'll link to her socials down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Helena Kerschner. Have you been practicing the ukulele this morning?
No, it's kind of just for decoration. We just have it, so we decided to put it up on the wall.
Okay. Well, okay. I guess if you're not going to use it, it might as well just hover over you like a dream catcher.
Exactly. I think it's kind of cute.
Is it trash day? Sorry about the random questions.
No, you're good. Yeah, it is actually. Yeah, that would be my friend, the garbage truck.
Oh, you have friends. I mean, that came out wrong. You have mechanical friends.
Yeah. Hopefully he goes away soon.
Were you interested in dump trucks as a young child?
Not at all.
Oh, really? Okay. So
No.
I don't want to dive right in, but like that was kind of a segue to the tomboyishness of your early childhood, if you had that going on.
That's actually an interesting one. I wasn't really ever a tomboy. I don't think I would consider myself like that. I wasn't really super feminine either, but I didn't have a preference either way. It was kind of
just
neutral.
You.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is your conversation. So, where do you want to go? Where do you want to lead me?
I watched both Kiara and Dagny's conversation with you. They had a lot of really good points and talked a lot about their experiences. I think they have more of that experience of being a tomboy. And I honestly don't really relate to that. So I don't know. I guess I'd love to talk about maybe kind of the politics behind some of the trans stuff, like some of my opinions on that, as well as social media and maybe the psychological and sociological aspects of this whole thing, because I'm really interested in that and I love thinking about it, and I want other people to know kind of more what is going on and my thoughts on how everything came about.
Okay. How everything came about with regards to where we're at right now as a society, a very particular society, North America, maybe Britain too.
Yeah, and I don't think I would be able to accurately explain it on a larger scale, like the big picture, but I can definitely give some insight into how individual girls specifically are finding it online and what kind of is causing them to be so passionate about it.
Okay. Would you want to start with your own personal journey and then go into the general, go from the specific?
For sure.
When did you start questioning your gender identity?
I was 15. Ironically, it was right after I started questioning my sexuality. I consider myself bisexual. But I started questioning that halfway into about my being 14 that year. And I had also been starting to use Tumblr more and more, and as I got more involved in the culture of Tumblr and started making friends on there and was introduced to concepts like sexuality and gender, I went to a Catholic school. My family never really talked about that kind of stuff. They weren't outwardly homophobic or anything, but it just wasn't anything discussed. I never thought about it. But as I started learning about that online, I started thinking about it for myself. So I started learning about the gender stuff online. Ironically, at first, I thought it was really stupid. In middle school, kind of before this period of my life, I was really edgy. I went on all sorts of like edgy sites like Reddit and stuff like that. And I was really into the edgy memes and stuff and making fun of SJWs.
Okay.
Yeah. So I thought it was really stupid, but as I started seeing it more and more and
Huh.
seeing more people talk about their personal experiences with gender, I started humanizing this experience and not really seeing it as just crazy SJWs
Yeah.
and more like people who had experiences like mine, and this is how they were processing it and dealing with it. So I eventually started relating to it and identifying as trans.
What do you think is the relationship between discovering your sexuality and the questioning of gender and gender roles?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of what kind of puts sexuality and gender identity in the same boat for people is that there's this feeling of alienation or wrongness that you have as a young person. I definitely don't think that society right now is like, for the most part, on a larger scale, like this awful homophobic society where, you know, no matter how old you are, you hate yourself and you hate being gay and all this stuff like it has been previously. But I do think that as a young person, especially someone who comes from more of a sheltered background in terms of sexuality, you do have this feeling of there's something wrong with me. And that can kind of make you feel like you are not like other girls or you're not like other guys. So it's a pretty easy segue to questioning your gender identity when you already have this kind of feeling of not fitting in or not being normal. And then you're looking for ways to explain that. And even if you're already questioning your sexuality, the gender thing can kind of like wiggle its way in there.
Yeah.
So I definitely think it's
a way out of, I guess, being a homosexual, or is it a way out or a way of coping with a sexuality that you feel emergent inside of you and yet from a cultural level is a bad thing?
Yeah, I definitely think for a lot of people that plays a big part. I think it plays more of a part for a lot of lesbian women than it ever did for me. I don't know. I felt a lot of shame, but I didn't attribute it directly to my sexuality, if that makes sense. I think a lot of especially gay people grow up thinking to themselves like, this particular thing, my sexuality, is the thing that's wrong. So I have to fix it in whatever way possible. I have to run away from it in whatever way possible. So I think for a lot of people that is a big thing. But for me, it was more of a general sense of wrongness or not belonging that happened because of a lot of factors, including sexuality, but not just the sexuality.
Yeah. And so how did you progress then from questioning into deciding on a course with regards to being trans, and how far did you end up going?
I actually did end up being on testosterone for almost 2 years.
What ages?
From like the week after I turned 18 to just before I turned 20.
Okay.
It was, I don't know, on Tumblr specifically, there's this attitude of like, if you have the slightest inclination that you might have a gender identity confusion or something like that, the healthiest thing for you to do would be to explore that and experiment with that. So I had close at the time who were also very avid users of Tumblr, and we all kind of had this feeling of unease. One of them is a gay man and one of them is a lesbian, so they had kind of these problems that we were talking about, and we would have a lot of conversations about gender, and we all kind of decided that we would experiment with it. So we all changed our pronouns and announced to our online community as well as our close circle of friends that we were going to change our pronouns, kind of like, oh, I don't know what my gender identity is, but I'm confused, so use they them pronouns or he him pronouns, or even neo pronouns like z zim and stuff like that. So it kind of went from not thinking about it at all to kind of thinking about it a little bit and exploring it to eventually I ended up just IDing as male.
Okay. And how did you end up expressing your maleness then? Was it in dress, or did you change your voice? And how much effort did you put into it? And
it was kind of interesting for me because I identified as trans for 5 years in total. So 3 years not transitioning, and then 2 years I actually physically transitioned. And the 3 years that I spent before I transitioned were all in high school, and I didn't want to come out while I was in high school for many reasons. I didn't want to tell my parents.
Catholic high school?
No, at that point I had moved to a different school, which was a public school. I just didn't want to come out because I was kind of on the outskirts of like my school community, and I just thought it would be embarrassing to come out even though I did want to. So I kind of just dressed completely as I always had, like as a girl, whatever that means. I didn't make any effort to present male, even though I did cut my hair, but that doesn't mean you're presenting male. And then as soon as I started T, that was the exact time when I actually started trying to pass as male. And I didn't really successfully pass as male until about a year into it.
Okay. And what was the experience of being on T for you?
At first, I was definitely really excited. I was really elated. I was really optimistic. But it is a common thing for women on testosterone to experience a lot of anger. There's this weird phenomenon where if you get upset and you want to cry, you can't cry. It's really strange, but I've heard a lot of trans guys say that they've been through that, and I went through that. So even though I was really elated at first, eventually these kinds of problems kept getting more apparent, and I started feeling really miserable.
By problems, do you mean like problems expressing emotion, or problems like even trying to figure out what you're feeling?
Yeah, like that, and also just the anger. I was angry like all the time.
Really?
Everything would make me angry all the time. And it was the strongest for like the first 3 months or so, and then it kind of evened out. But by that time, I just felt like I had been put through the ringer.
Wow.
Through all these emotional changes.
How did you end up dealing with the anger? Did you have an outlet for it, or did it just steep
I
inside?
kind of just stewed in it. It was really not a fun experience for me. I know that's not the same for everybody, but for me, it was just purely the effects of testosterone on the way I was experiencing my life were not great. I didn't have really the mental health to be able to do anything with my life that I really wanted. I was in school, and I just was going through this period of time where I was isolating. I was angry all the time, so I didn't go to class. I don't know. It just kind of really messed with my mental health.
So this is something I neglected to speak about with your compatriots, but in moving into like getting on T and initiating a physical transformation, did you have anybody to speak to in the medical establishment, anybody official, like a psychologist or anybody that was helping you along the way?
No.
That was acting as a gatekeeper or a mentor?
No, actually, this is probably the thing about the experience that pisses me off the most, because as my 18th birthday was approaching, I was looking for clinics that would do informed consent, because there was one clinic in my hometown that was the traditional route of like, you apply and then you get therapy and then you have to go to all these appointments and then eventually they might prescribe you testosterone. But the waiting list for this clinic was so long, it was like a year and a half or something. So my other option was to go through informed consent. At the time in my hometown, there wasn't any informed consent clinics. So I had to drive to the nearest city that there was, something like that, which was like a 6-hour drive.
Oh, wow.
So I made this appointment. I know. And I lied to my parents about where I was. I told them I was going for a sleepover, but in reality, I was driving to this other city to get hormones. A week before my 18th birthday, I made this appointment for a week after my 18th birthday. I drove up there. They gave me my T, 1-hour appointment. I drove back. And then there wasn't a lot of follow-up. There was one phone call that I had 2 weeks after the appointment where they asked, like, are you having any side effects? I said no, and then I never talked to them again.
Oh, wow. Okay. So by informed consent, do they, like, give you a pamphlet and trust that you've read it?
Yeah. Basically, my appointment was kind of 2 half-hour sections. One was talking to a social worker where she just asked, like, how long have you been experiencing dysphoria? Do you want male characteristics? And I had all these rehearsed answers that maybe I didn't actually genuinely believe. But it's really popular for the trans community to like help each other rehearse answers and tell each other what to say to doctors and stuff like that. So I gave her my answers. She said, okay. And then the next half hour was reading over the pamphlet, the informed consent pamphlet, and then signing it.
Okay.
And then I got my prescription.
Like when you open up iTunes for the first time, you just kind of scroll through it and click the box.
Yeah, pretty much.
Have you done much research in the side effects of tea? And did you do it before you started going on it?
I knew a little bit. I knew that a lot of trans men end up needing hysterectomies around the 5-year mark.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's pretty common because just this new having a lot of testosterone and not a lot of estrogen and progesterone and all this other hormones that are typical for the female body, for organs that are in your reproductive system that rely on those to function, it can really mess things up. Your uterus and ovaries can start atrophying. You can have vaginal atrophy and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of trans men end up experiencing extreme pain or even, I don't know, all sorts of other complications that in the end they need to have hysterectomies. And I was aware of this, but I kind of saw it as like, well, there's so much activism going on that probably by the time that's my problem, doctors will figure something out. So I did not take it as seriously as I should have.
Were you on testosterone as well as like some sort of estrogen blocker, or do you just put it both in the system and hope for the best?
Yeah. I know trans women or males who go on estrogen, they do have to take testosterone blockers. Okay. But I don't think women ever have to take any kind of estrogen blocker. I'm not really sure a lot about how it works, but I know that they just give you the testosterone, usually.
And what initiated your turn back?
As I said earlier, I was just starting to get really miserable, and
how did you know that? Like looking outside of you at the way that the world was acting towards you, or was it like an internal, just like a kind of, you took a inventory of what you've been experiencing?
It was very internal. The only really like experience with the world being unaccepting of me was my parents. They weren't cruel to me. They didn't insult me or anything like that. They just did not validate my gender identity. So we got in a lot of fights. Oh, yeah. And they acted in really inappropriate ways, but I also acted in really inappropriate ways. I would say really hateful things towards them. So for a while we didn't talk. For like 6 months or so, I just blocked their numbers. Oh, wow. So that was hard for me. Yeah. But other than that, I didn't experience any kind of discrimination or I went to a liberal arts university and then I moved to Chicago. Like, there's no such thing as transphobia in those locations. I mean, maybe there is, but in my experience, there wasn't. Everything was very happy, queer, all that kind of stuff. So it was a lot of internal stuff. It was just, a big part was looking back on my life and how in high school, I had this dysphoria that was making me really depressed, and it was really painful for me at the time. And on testosterone, my dysphoria did lessen. I did enjoy seeing like this male figure in the mirror, but something about the fact that in high school, I was depressed, but reasonably functional. And then on T, I just completely fell apart. And that was so confusing to me, and I didn't understand it for a long time. But at some point, I just had to say, this is not working. I need to reevaluate. I need to reevaluate what my dysphoria means, how I'm supposed to be treating it, what is good for me, because this is obviously not good for me.
Did you have resources then? And the other question is, did you have problems with the community when you decided to desist?
I had a lot of problems with the community online. As for support, I had a therapist, but it was through like the LGBT center in Chicago. So they did not really help me question things at all. Like even when I told my therapist, I think I have to detransition, she literally said, but you have dysphoria. She was so confused by this concept that I wanted to detransition.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So I didn't have a lot of support in that respect. It was mostly just me being like, okay, this is really fucked up. I need to figure this out, and this is not working. Initiating
the discussion about detransition is really important because there is a number of people who need to at least have this as a part of the discussion. So it seems like that wasn't a part of the discussion when you started to go through this.
Not at all. The only experience I had with detransition was my two friends that I mentioned from high school. They eventually desisted way before I did, and I was really angry at them for that. There was one friend of mine online who transitioned and then detransitioned, and I viewed it as triggering, so I just blocked her on Tumblr. Everything about detransitioning I saw as triggering because it made me doubt myself, and so I just blocked it out of my view. If I was trans identified right now in this period of time and there was someone like us who was starting this conversation, generating all this conversation in the trans community, because I've seen a lot of it, I've gone and kind of peeked in trans Twitter and trans Tumblr, and there's actually people talking about our videos. So I think if there had been that discussion, it would have been useful and I wouldn't have been able to block it out as easily. But as for people reacting to us, the biggest thing that I've gotten is like, one, just because you didn't like transitioning doesn't mean that you can invalidate all trans people. You're so bitter. You should just focus on something else. Focus on bettering the world in an actual way instead of hating trans people. And then this is so sad. The TERFs brainwash detransition women into hating trans people. Yeah, exactly. So I've gotten a little bit of that. No really direct hate my way, no threats or anything like that, but just people jumping through all sorts of hoops to disqualify what we have to say.
What was it like when you started going desisting, and then how did you feel once you had desisted, and what changed about life and internally and externally for you?
Every detransition is kind of different. I don't claim that everyone has my experience, but in my experience, I was a very, very, very radical trans activist.
Okay.
Which
is interesting because when you're 14, you're kind of like an anti-SJW, edgelord kind of thing. Huh.
It's really weird. And I have actually met a couple of detransition women who have the same experience of they were edgy and then suddenly their brain got hijacked and they became SJWs and then they went back to being edgy. So as I said, I was super into trans activism. I was super into this gender ideology. And when I first decided I had to detransition, I didn't see it as oh, I'm not trans. It's just, oh, I'm not a trans man, but I'm definitely not a girl. Okay. So I identified as non-binary for about 4 months after I got off T. And I was still just what the fuck? This is so stupid. I'm not happy. There's something wrong. And as I started kind of seeing the errors in the own way that I was thinking throughout my transition, but also at that point, I started seeing some of the flaws with the trans ideology as a whole. And so I started just being more aware of it. And I saw a lot of parts of the community that I started thinking were really toxic and really messed up. So after that, I just bit the bullet and I went onto Reddit Gender Critical, which at the time, I was like, okay, these are evil TERFs. They're horrible. But it's such a big subreddit that maybe there are a couple people who can help me because I don't know who else to ask. There's nothing out there. So I went on there and they were so sweet to me. I typed this long, frantic sob freak out story and I got 150 comments and they were really, really sweet to me. So just seeing that, I was like, oh my God, I was so wrong. And I started thinking about it differently. And I started exposing myself to more gender critical beliefs. For a while, I got super into radical feminism, but then I noticed okay, this is just another ideology.
I've had some discussions with detransitioned white nationalists or white supremacists who were really heavy white supremacists, and then they went out of that, and then they just end up being radical SJWs. It seems like when we get ideologically possessed, it almost feels like we're curing ourselves by just being possessed in another way.
Yeah.
And how are you, what are the tools and how do you know that you're not going too far when you go from one ideology to another? And how do you pull yourself back and keep yourself
I think
back?
A lot of it has to do with self-awareness because especially when you're kind of indoctrinated from a young age, your brain develops a way of thinking that it's just very polarized, it's very black and white, it's very extremist. So even when you start noticing the flaws with that original ideology, if you don't pay attention to the way that you're thinking, it's very easy to go and just dive straight into another ideology because you feel guilty, you feel betrayed, you feel like you were wronged, you feel like you've lost I mean, I at least I felt like I had lost years of my life believing something that was a lie. So it was really easy for me to just dive right in, because radical feminists have a lot of really good analysis of the trans movement. They have other flaws, but they also have a lot of good analysis. So it was really easy for me to just dive right into that. But eventually I was able to have the self-awareness to just say, like, okay, step back. This got you into trouble the first time. You need to think for yourself. You can't listen to just what other people are saying. And I was also just noticing a lot of issues with, I guess, leftist politics as a whole, just in our society right now. And I started getting really critical. It's all about self-awareness and just awareness in what you're looking at and what you're reading and who is saying this. Why are they saying it? What motive do they have? What is their background? All this stuff. Are you just listening to what someone's saying because it sounds like it makes sense, or does it actually make sense and align with your values?
Your generation has grown up with the internet and chat forums and, like you said, Reddit and Tumblr and stuff. And so I think you guys are developing a knowledge base that, or an expertise in a mode of human behavior that's pretty, I don't think a lot of adults understand. And I think, just to kind of swerve a little bit, just to make an example, the way that the last few years that college campuses have erupted in protest in very weird ways, I think a lot of the ways that the adults mishandled that is because they didn't understand how Facebook and Twitter and social media was actually galvanizing and really enforcing groupthink and action ahead of like consideration and stuff. So I want to use that as a segue into what is your take on, I guess, specifically the trans ideology and how it's operating as just in a general sense online to enforce a certain sort of policy and behavior and police the outside world. And what are your thoughts on that?
I definitely think it's a really big problem. I have a lot of concern over trans activists' interest in children. I think that it's really harmful for an ideology to be peddled to children. I'm not really sure how the ideology made its way onto Tumblr and made its way into my community, but I do know that a bunch of struggling, socially isolated kids who a lot of the times are struggling with their sexuality or their mental health are the most susceptible to ideology. And then the fact that they're bringing it into schools at younger and younger ages. And there's these organizations like Gender Spectrum and Mermaids who are campaigning for less gatekeeping for transitioning of younger and younger kids. That's definitely my biggest concern. And I do think that either consciously or subconsciously, they're using the naivety of teenagers and children to kind of spread these ideas. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what the end goal is.
Yeah, what is the end goal?
I know. I'm not sure. But I want to understand that desperately.
I like what you said about caring about dysphoric people, and maybe we can talk a little bit about your experience with dysphoria, and just to provide like what kind of resources are there out there to recognize, to properly diagnose somebody's dysphoria, and what are things that exacerbated it? Do you think that thinking about it more and more like made the problem bigger and bigger for you, like when you were a teenager?
Definitely.
And is there any way to slow down that snowball effect of becoming obsessed with that?
See, that one's hard, because I do think a lot of it comes from being online all the time. Just from my experience, I was really isolated. I didn't have a lot of friends. It started when I was in Catholic school, but I ended up switching schools in the very beginning of my Tumblr usage. But in the very beginning of when I started using Tumblr, I didn't have any friends at school. I was bullied at school. I was super isolated. I didn't really relate to my parents because they worked all the time and stuff like that. So I felt really alone. And so I used Tumblr as like my primary community. Yeah. So if there is a way to, I don't know, stop this reliance on social media to replace the face-to-face human intimacy that we're actually designed for, I think that would help a lot of people escape the obsessive thinking, because it's an echo chamber.
Yeah, and there's no way to slow it down, because the ideas are abstracted from that patient slow. We're having a conversation back and forth. I can't just yell at you and then block you. Like in this conversation, I guess we could both just unplug the microphones and stuff, but we've already established in this form of communication, like kind of like a playing field that's a little slower. It has, like you said, we're more designed for that. But when we remove that, and this is just an analogy, I don't want to get in trouble, but like with pornography or male addiction to pornography, it abstracts that human relationship, that slows it down, contextualizes it, makes it something more than just neurons firing in the brain, makes it like a form of communication. Like pornography, it just spirals out of control on the internet, because like, and it just gets more and more extreme, because you're just playing with chemicals at this point. And the same thing can happen with an ideology, where it's abstracted, it's memified in a way, and then you have a bunch of reinforcing things. So if you don't, if that's your only option for having a community, then maybe the only way to like provide like a fixative for that is to provide healthier communities, maybe. But like, is it less attractive the less radical a community is for young people?
That's a curious one. I've been thinking a lot about how we can help kids in this situation, because I mean, none of them walk into it expecting to be radicalized into an ideology. Like, you don't purposefully do that. It's a snowball effect of like, you see something, it makes a little bit of sense. You see something else, it makes a little bit of sense. Oh, someone else has this opinion, it makes a little bit of sense. Someone else has this opinion, it makes a little bit of sense. And gradually you start building these beliefs. And then as you get more into it, you see people having more abstracted views, more kind of radicalized opinions and statements that they make about this topic. And it just becomes this massive web of ideas that you're trying to navigate. And when all of your friends are also doing the same thing and navigating these ideas that are so separated from reality, that it's occupying your whole mind, and outside of Tumblr, no one's talking about it. So when it's occupying your whole mind and it's so abstracted from reality that you can't talk about it anywhere else but Tumblr, then it just makes it impossible to really slow down and think critically. So
Did you experience a form of ideological dysphoria, where like you're so obsessed with this stuff on the internet, but then you go out into the real world and you're like, what is this real world thing? Why isn't anybody talking about this stuff? What was that like then?
It's hard to explain. It's like, in the trans community, there's like the disdain for cis people because they're privileged and all this stuff. But it's more than that. It's almost like you have this experience with your trans friends online, and then you see the cis people in the real world, and it just seems like you're from two different planets. And like, you will never be able to relate to those cis or normal people and stuff like that. So when I would be at school, or when I would be participating in activities through school or through my actual real world community, I felt this profound sense of alienation because my priority was Tumblr and my friends on Tumblr. And I thought that the ideology that we had was so much more progressive, so much more woke, so much better. And I just thought that everyone outside of that ideology was an absolute ignorant plebeian, had 2 brain cells at most.
Did that alienation express itself as resentment? Did you start to resent the people around you? And how did you end up expressing that? Or did you just keep that resentment online?
I had a lot of resentment, to the point where my 2 friends that I mentioned, they desisted. One of them, after she desisted, I bitched her out over text message. I told her she was privileged and had no idea what it was like, and like, oh, it must be so nice to just be able to stop identifying as trans, but I'm actually trans and you're so privileged and all this stuff. And we didn't talk for a couple months. And then my other friend, the guy, I did something similar to him and we still don't talk. I had a lot of resentment that played out in the real world like that. And then my resentment online was just constantly making angry posts and interacting with other angry people in the same boat. And just this anger would just fester in this bubble of just thinking that we had it so much worse. We were so special. We were so unique.
Yeah. And when you began the arc of desistance, it seems like there would be a dual kind of change then, or dual detransition from the ideology and from the whole expression of that and the testosterone. Which was more difficult?
I think the ideological aspect. The same can't really be said for everyone because not everyone was as hardcore as I was. But for me, it's like I believed this so strongly and so strictly for so long that to have it forcibly, like the illusion be forcibly broken by the fact that I was desisting and that I wasn't really a trans man. Like all of this was influenced by my mental health, my alienation, sex stereotypes, and just realizing that and how that did not align with what I had believed so hard was insane.
Wow.
And I'm still kind of, now it's really fun for me to look at all sorts of different worldviews and kind of figure out what I really believe. But for a long time, I've been detransitioned for almost a year, or exactly a year. I don't know.
Happy birthday.
But
or D-Day.
D-Day. I don't know. But definitely the ideological aspect has been way more impactful on me than the physical transition. The physical transition, all I really had to do was stop testosterone and go back to wearing what I always wore, which is just sweatshirts and leggings and stuff. But the ideological aspect was changing everything about what I thought made me a human being.
What was the experience of going off T? How did that affect you? And was it a positive experience, or was it a rocky road?
Not really. I just kind of stopped taking my testosterone. T didn't really change that much about my body anyway. I don't know why, but
just anger. Then I guess you said like you had some emotional amplification.
Yeah, I had a lot of emotional issues, but physically wise, there wasn't really much to detransition from. My face is a little bit different, but like it's not that big of a deal. I never got any surgeries or anything, and I wasn't on T long enough to have any serious changes. And my voice is different, obviously, but in terms of the ideology, that has been an active effort on my part to question everything.
So what are some of the ways that you've seen to reach out to people, or do you think that people just need to go through this themselves and either be thrown out or go through some sort of waking up experience? Is there any way to reach out?
I think that kind of experience that you just mentioned is the most efficient way. Like in a community where everyone's fighting so much and the smallest mistake can get you crucified in the town square, it's not going to be a long time before people have these experiences and they get burned and they realize something's wrong. But I also do think that for people who maybe aren't as far into like this radical left side, if you can reach out to those people and just encourage critical thinking, not really reach out from a perspective of telling them what to think to change their beliefs, but to encourage critical thinking, to encourage looking at things and listening to people who you disagree with or make you uncomfortable and thinking about what they're saying and why they're saying it. Because it's not true that all conservatives are just terrible bigots. They have actual moral, ethical, spiritual reasons for what they believe. And when you understand that, it makes it a lot easier to have a conversation. And so I think we need to encourage people to think critically and humanize people that they disagree with. And I think there's a lot of potential for people who aren't as far to come to those kinds of conclusions.
Yeah. It seems so much more fun to be engaging in ideas and being in a state of questioning. And I guess intellectual humility is one way of framing it. Like, I don't know everything. It just seems so much more fun and engaging and experimental and filled with possibility than knowing what's right and trying to force the world to go on the right path, which seems just so stressful and just filled with, like, you're setting yourself up for a lot of misery. That's
it's
just
very
my
stressful.
Yeah.
Oh, you're completely right. Like, just from my experience in being in that very radical left community, like, I was a radical trans activist. I was a communist. I was really supportive of, like, Antifa. I was really supportive of the kind of radical queer, like, sex work, kink, stuff like that. But I really didn't know what I was talking about. But there's this pressure to constantly act like you know what you're talking about and to say everything with such conviction. And eventually you're going to run into a situation where you say some shit you can't back up and people are going to fight you over it.
Yeah.
And it's so much more liberating to allow yourself to think and to not have to say everything with such conviction and to not have to have such a strong opinion on everything all the time.
How do we reach teenagers? How do we reach 14, 15-year-olds?
It's very hard for people who have been through this kind of journey and have been woken up to the flaws in this way of thinking to go back and reach people who haven't been through that. It's like with everything that kids do. Like parents and other adults will tell kids, like, don't do this. I've been through this. It's bad. It's not good. Like, go to school, do your homework, exercise. But you don't listen when you're young.
Yeah, okay.
And so that's really hard. And I don't know, because there are a lot of, I guess, gender critical people on Tumblr, but also Tumblr is one of the most hostile atmospheres in terms of gender critical versus trans activist.
Yeah.
So it's like everywhere where there are these vulnerable kids, there's also this system in place that prevents them from really looking at anything contrary to that particular narrative.
Wow.
And demonizing anyone on the outside of that particular narrative. So I think for me, the thing that I'm starting to consider that's most important is honestly the parents and teaching them how to navigate this situation in the most productive way, because I guess a lot of parents don't consider this stuff. Like they're just normal parents living their normal lives with their normal kids, and then suddenly their kid comes out as trans.
Yeah.
So, and then they end up handling it in the wrong way because there's not a lot of information. They don't know how to handle it. They're freaking out. So if we can kind of spread awareness that, like, okay, unfortunately we live in a society where it might be a reality that your kid is going to go through this, and to kind of spread awareness to people in the general population on how, like, what to do, how to teach your child critical thinking, how to help them navigate the online world, and to educate parents on what goes on in the online world because they have no idea.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that would be the most helpful, because unfortunately, once you actually get online, there's not a lot that you can do. And even if parents do cut their kids off from being online, they'll find another way, and that'll build resentment, and they'll trust their parents less and trust the people online more.
Yeah.
So if you can help parents build trust and help parents educate their kids and give them the skills to navigate all these different ideologies with a critical eye, I think that will be the most important thing for kids individually. And then, working to change the narrative as well, so that we don't have this general
combative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One criticism that I've seen on in the comment fields of this miniseries within a larger miniseries on gender, sexuality, and then detransition. One of the things it seems like the question is, how do you diagnose yourself as not trans? And it seems like your answer to this, and I want you to expound on this if you want, is it seems like you just took. You looked at your emotional compass and you saw that you were miserable, and that's what led you. And how do you know when you're not lying to yourself? How do you know when you're following the right path or you're on the wrong path?
I think it has to start with the general narrative that we're portraying to people, because something that I really disagree with is that there's real trans people and then there's people who get confused. And that's kind of a narrative that, one, is pushed upon me, that I was never really trans. I just got confused.
Yeah.
And also, it's not true. What I believe in my theory is that there is gender dysphoria. It's a psychological condition in which you feel extreme distress with your biological sex and your sex characteristics.
Yeah.
And the mistake is that even people who believe that gender dysphoria is a psychological condition, which not all people do, sadly, they believe that the treatment to gender dysphoria is always transition. And if transition doesn't work for you, you never had gender dysphoria. Oh. And what I want to say is that gender dysphoria can have many different treatments. Yeah. That we need to research. We need to allow conversation. We need to literally allow people to research instead of deplatforming them and firing them, so that we can figure out what kind of treatments are going to work. Is CBT going to work? are similar treatments to something like an eating disorder or a body dysmorphic disorder going to work? Because obviously transition isn't working for anyone. And I find it very hard to believe that I can identify as trans for 5 years and I was never really trans, or someone can go and get genital reconstruction surgery, but then they were never really trans. I just don't agree with that. So I think the conversation on what is being trans, is there such thing as transgender, or is it people with gender dysphoria choosing to transition?
Yeah.
Do all people with gender dysphoria have to transition? I think we need to enable that discussion and change that narrative.
Okay. Yeah. Do you still experience dysphoria?
It's a lot more occasional because it got a lot worse while I was transitioning because I didn't want to be a trans man. I wanted to be a man. And so that is not humanly possible, despite what people will try to tell you. So once I kind of had to admit I'm never going to be a man, I just have to accept the body that I was given, the body that I have, and just work all the time to accept that. It's a lot. I have a dysphoria a lot less, and when I do have it, it's a lot less painful because I don't have this, I guess, deluded wish that if I chase this long enough, I will someday be enough of a man to not feel like I want to be a biological male.
Do you feel disgust with the woman form that you have, or do you feel like something's missing, or that you're not who you are, that you're not, there's a disconnect between self-perception and physical reality?
Yeah, it genuinely feels like you were born in the wrong body. Like, it just feels like you look at this and you're like, this is wrong. And it's almost like a mourning. Like you're mourning the fact that you were stuck in this cage. And it's a very painful feeling. And it's about your body as a whole. It's about the way society treats you, but it's also about individual body parts that you just can't stand to look at. And you're always aware of them. It's not just like when you look in the mirror. It's like you're constantly acutely aware that you have this body part, or your body is shaped in a certain way, or someone is looking at you and perceiving a female. And
so part of the way that you cope with that is just kind of like a very long regimen of self-acceptance, or just basically denying that feeling. Is there any positive things? And furthermore, have you gone to any therapy, or are you engaged in any like research on like what's going on with this? Do we know what's going on in your case?
I don't think we really know what's going on, but I am seeing a therapist, but most of my healing has been done through examining where my dysphoria came from. I mean, it is really good to just accept your physical material reality and that you can't change your biological sex. But also, like, dysphoria, for a lot of people, I mean, we don't know if there could be biological components to dysphoria. We don't know that.
Okay.
But I think for a lot of people, sex stereotypes are a big thing. And I know for me, when I look back on it, the, I guess, kind of moment where I started feeling this unhappiness with my female body is like, I wasn't a tomboy, but I always felt like I had a more male brain or way of thinking, which is, I mean, sexist, because not all women are just dumb bimbos. But so I related to a lot of boys, and I had a lot of boy friends when I was younger. But then as like puberty started hitting, the attitudes that boys and girls had to each other were no longer really neutral. It was kind of like, oh, we're girls and they're boys. Or like I would be with my guy friends and I was no longer one of the guys. Like I was this other thing, growing boobs and having a period and stuff. So I associated the development of these new things with this feeling of alienation.
So was it a feeling of loss? Was puberty like you were being added to with womanness? Like there was you, and then like all of a sudden all this like womanness is stacking, or was it like a loss of something?
So kind of before puberty, when I was a little kid and all my friends were little kids, there wasn't a lot of talk about like gender. Nobody thought about dating and all this stuff because we were just kids and shit. Yeah. And I just happened to have more guy friends. It's not because I was like, oh, I'm a guy and I hate girls. It's like I just had a lot of guy friends. And then as puberty came along, it was like forcibly taking me away from that and categorizing me into something that I didn't relate with. So it was just
Yeah.
like this feeling of like, no, like bring it back. Like I don't want
Yeah.
to, but you can't reverse puberty. So I guess the way my brain processed that was saying like I was meant to be a guy.
Yeah, and then you have the coping mechanism of this narrative that would say that you're just in the wrong body, or like the whole trans or the gender ideology. Something that like I've been thinking about or playing with. It's a tweet, but I don't know how to phrase it in tweet length. But in having discussions with you ladies and with Megan Murphy, who's a feminist, I'm coming into contact with a section of society that I haven't before, which is kind of like the radical, kind of angry radical feminists. And I'm not saying that like all feminists are angry, but like there's this subset.
Disclaimer.
Yeah. But like it seems like there's these really angry feminists and these really angry men's rights activists. And it's just making me think like that there's like these clans, there's these gender clans that, and there's a small part of them that are at war. And I'm wondering like and to extrapolate on that or to back away from the intensity of that, I wonder if like there's not like a need for gender centrism, right? Like a broader space for not needing to commit to these not just sex roles, but just plugging into society and plugging into friendships. And I wonder if that's even possible, because it seems like kids just kind of naturally shake out into sex characteristics are informing them in two different ways. But
I think a lot of the anger comes from people just finding like they stick to their ideology, they stick to their crew, and they have these very strict ideological beliefs, and then obviously there's going to be the opposite of that ideological belief, and then they're going to fight and they're going to make each other more angry, and then they're each stuck in their own echo chambers where they're perceiving the other side maybe in a different way than it actually is. So I think to combat that, we need to stress compassion, humanizing the other side, and thinking like, okay, maybe they have some real shit beliefs, but they believe it for a reason, and it might not be just because they're bigoted, hateful people.
Yeah.
They have a story, and you don't have to agree with them, but you should make an effort to understand that they have a story and try to come together. And I think we also need to prioritize just science and fact-based thinking, because like, for example, with a lot of radical feminists, I agree with a lot of their analysis, but also some of the things they say are just blatantly anti-scientific. For example, that there's no differences between like male brains and female brains. And I think that's an oversimplification. From what I understand, it's like there are characteristics of the brain that can correlate with biological sex, and they can cause differences. But it's not like there is a cookie cutter male brain and a cookie cutter female brain. Yeah. But with some radical feminists, they perceive it as we're all blank slates, and every single difference between men and women is societally based, and it's all rooted in patriarchy. And so just when you think about things that way, it's unscientific, it's ideologically based. There's going to be a lot of anger because someone else who has a different ideology, equally unscientific, equally whatever the hell, you're going to have fighting. So I think we need to encourage people to think in a more scientifically based and rational way, and also to have compassion.
Okay. It's been so amazing that you guys have almost all spoken with me. I have one more.
Jesse,
yeah. And we'll be speaking pretty soon.
Awesome.
So thank you so much. And I don't know how to wrap this up. Do you have anything profound that we can end on? Not to put you on the spot, but could you play that ukulele maybe, or drive a dump truck or whatever?
Sure.
I saw her standing on the precipice, catching chill in a sequin dress, and I came up close and I gave her a rose so she wouldn't jump off. She looked at me with an askance face, said, bro, you're violating my space, would you please step back? I like the feel of the wind on my skin. For the last time, would you let it go? I didn't mean to be a bastard. I was just passing the time with a joke. I promise I won't try to be funny with you anymore. At least not all at your expense.